Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful and moving experiences that remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Today's story is about a mother's unwavering fight for her son, Alex, who faces a medical condition that many people don't understand: epilepsy. What happens when a teacher dismisses his needs? And how does his mother take a stand for him? This is a story of courage, resilience, and the importance of empathy. Stay tuned as we walk you through their journey. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story. I've always been incredibly proud of my son, Alex. From the moment he was born, there was something about him that made me stand a little taller. He wasn't like the other children, not because he was different in any negative sense, but because he had this deep, innate curiosity that drove him to learn and explore, even when the world seemed to stand in his way. It wasn't just his inquisitive mind that set him apart, though. There was a kindness in him, a tenderness that made him approachable, someone you couldn't help but be drawn to. I always thought that no matter what challenges came his way, Alex would meet them head-on, with a quiet strength that belied his age. I remember the first time I noticed something wasn't quite right with him. Alex was only 5 years old when we were at a family outing in the park. A place where the sunlight dappled the trees and the air was filled with the sounds of joy and laughter. Alex had been running around, chasing a frisbee with a bright smile. The kind of smile that made you feel like everything in the world was just as it should be. But then, in an instant, his body went rigid, his legs buckled, and he fell to the ground. The world around me seemed to slow down as I rushed to him, calling his name, but he couldn't hear me. The entire family was frozen in place, unsure of what was happening. The moment stretched into eternity. But it lasted only a few seconds. The doctors explained later that it was a seizure, a tonic seizure. One where his muscles completely stiffened and he lost consciousness. Though it was not as dramatic as the kind of seizures you see in movies. Even after the doctors reassured us, I couldn't shake the fear that had taken hold of my heart. What followed was a series of tests, countless visits to specialists, and a whirlwind of emotions. Alex was diagnosed with epilepsy. And my world, our world, seemed to shift beneath our feet. The days ahead would be a mix of joy and adjustment, of learning how to cope with something that would be with him for the rest of his life. But through it all, Alex remained his resilient self. He didn't let the diagnosis define him. Even as a child, he showed maturity beyond his years. He never complained. He learned quickly how to recognize the auras, the strange sensations that would precede a seizure. Tingling in his limbs, a metallic taste in his mouth, or sometimes, inexplicable smells or tastes. As a mother, I felt both pride and sadness at how quickly Alex adapted to his new reality. By the time he turned 10, Alex could not only recognize these signs but had become so responsible that he knew exactly what to do when he felt one coming on. He had a box in his backpack with his medication. A small pill that could stop a seizure if taken at the right moment. This pill wasn't just a lifeline, it was a symbol of how far Alex had come in learning to take charge of his own life. The school became a place of both growth and challenge. We sat down before he started middle school and had long conversations about how he would handle things in the classroom. I made sure that the school knew about his condition, ensuring that his teachers would be prepared and that Alex had access to his medication during school hours. I was confident that he would thrive despite the obstacles epilepsy placed in his path. Little did I know that the real struggle would come not from the seizures themselves, but from the ignorance and indifference of the people around him. People who should have been there to help and support him. His homeroom teacher, Mrs. Jessica, was a woman I didn't think much about at first. She was polite enough during the parent orientation, but there was something distant about her, something that I couldn't quite place. At first, I brushed it off, assuming she was just busy and hadn't had a chance to get to know us. I didn't anticipate that this would be the teacher who would become a major source of conflict in Alex's life. What I didn't realize was that Rebecca's ignorance would soon lead to a moment that would change everything. It began as any normal school day. Alex woke up early, took his medication, and double-checked that the pill he might need in an emergency was in his bag. I reminded him, as I always did, to alert his teacher if he felt a seizure coming on and to take his medication immediately. With a kiss and a ruffle of his hair, I sent him off to school, confident that he was prepared. But little did I know, that day would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one that would bring an unwelcome challenge for both of us. In his homeroom class, Alex began to feel the familiar tingling in his arms, the warning signs of an impending seizure. He didn't panic. Instead, he reached for the box that contained his rescue pill. But Mrs. Jessica, noticing his actions, approached him. What followed was nothing short of shocking. Instead of offering help, she demanded to know what he was doing. When Alex explained, trying to stay calm despite the growing fear, she refused to listen. She dismissed his medication as unnecessary, even accusing him of faking his illness to get attention. To this day, I can't fathom how someone, a teacher who is supposed to care for and guide children, could be so dismissive of a child's medical needs. And when she took that pill, that simple but vital piece of medicine, and threw it in the trash, I felt a surge of helplessness and anger. Little did she know, Alex's body was already preparing for the seizure that would soon take hold. Alex had tried to remain composed when Mrs. Jessica took his medication. But as his symptoms worsened, the anxiety took hold. He knew that time was running out. His muscles began to stiffen, and the tingling sensation in his limbs became more intense, like an electric current flowing through his body. He could feel the metallic taste intensifying in his mouth, a sure sign that a seizure was about to take over. He tried to stay calm, but his body was no longer cooperating. In a moment of desperation, Alex begged Mrs. Jessica to understand, to believe him when he said that he needed the medication to stop the seizure. But she simply stood there, arms crossed, her expression cold and dismissive. "You don't need this," she said dismissively, looking at him like he was making up some kind of excuse. "You're just faking it to get attention. Toughen up." Her words cut through him like a blade. Alex had never felt more alone, more misunderstood. How could she say such things when he was trying to explain something so crucial? And how could she ignore the very real symptoms he was experiencing? But despite the growing panic within him, Alex didn't want to cause a scene. He didn't want to feel more vulnerable than he already did. So he remained quiet, his mind racing as his body began to seize. The moments that followed felt like they happened in slow motion. Alex could no longer hold himself up, and he collapsed onto his desk, his body frozen in place, unresponsive. His classmates were startled, some of them shrieking in alarm, unsure of what was happening. But Mrs. Jessica? She just stood there, frozen in shock, not knowing what to do. She had no idea how to help him, no idea how to react to the very real medical emergency unfolding right before her eyes. The room fell into chaos. And it wasn't until Alex's body had finally relaxed, and he regained consciousness, that the reality of what had just happened truly began to sink in. His vision was blurry, and his thoughts were scattered. His head throbbed, and he felt a deep sense of confusion. The embarrassment flooded over him in waves as he slowly realized where he was and what had just occurred. But the most painful part was how he felt in that moment, humiliated and weak. He had no control over his body. And now, he had no control over his emotions either. Tears welled up in his eyes. Not just from the physical toll of the seizure, but from the emotional devastation of being treated like he wasn't taken seriously. And when Alex tried to explain himself, when he tried to put into words just how terrified he was, Mrs. Jessica showed no empathy, no remorse. "You're fine," she said coldly, her voice lacking any compassion. "You just need to suck it up and stop pretending." Those words felt like a slap in the face. How could she be so heartless? How could she dismiss his very real suffering so easily? How could someone entrusted with the care of children, especially one who was supposed to understand the medical needs of her students, be so negligent and cruel? It was beyond comprehension. I remember when Alex called me later that day. His voice was shaky, filled with a sadness I couldn't ignore. "Mom, can you pick me up? I had a seizure in class," he said, his words trembling. "Mrs. Jessica," she threw my medicine away. She said I didn't need it. And then it was too late. I could hear the strain in his voice, the effort he was making to stay composed. But it was clear that he was breaking. And as I listened to him, my heart broke right along with him. I didn't know how something so cruel could happen to my son. How could a teacher, someone who was supposed to protect and support him, do something so reckless and dangerous? I rushed to the school as quickly as I could, my mind racing with a mix of worry, confusion, and anger. How could this happen? How could Mrs. Jessica be so ignorant, so dismissive of Alex's condition? By the time I arrived, I found Alex in the school office, his face swollen from crying, his eyes red. He looked exhausted, drained of all his usual energy, as though he had been robbed of something fundamental. I hugged him tightly, holding him close as if trying to protect him from the world, from the cruel hands that had just shaken his confidence to its core. "You're safe now," I whispered, even though I knew the damage had already been done. "We're going to figure this out. I promise." But as we walked through the halls, I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. This wasn't just about Alex's seizure anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about the failure of a teacher, of an adult in a position of authority, to understand the needs of a child. This was about ignorance and carelessness. And it was something I couldn't let slide. I couldn't just let this be forgotten. I had to confront Mrs. Jessica, to demand accountability for what she had done. And so, after I had comforted Alex as best as I could, I made my way straight to her classroom, knowing full well that what I was about to do would be difficult. But I couldn't back down now. When I found her, she was cleaning up after the lesson, acting as if nothing had happened. Her expression hardened when she saw me. "Rebecca," I said, keeping my voice steady, though the anger simmered beneath the surface. "I need you to return my son's medication and apologize to him." Her response was cold, dismissive. "I don't know what you're talking about. That medication is dangerous for children," she said with a smirk. I threw it away. "Maybe you should pay more attention to your son instead of relying on pills to parent him." I could feel my temper flare, but I fought to stay calm. "That medication was prescribed by a doctor," I said firmly, my voice unwavering. "You had no right to take it from him, let alone throw it away." She shrugged it off like it was no big deal. But to me, it was everything. It was my son's well-being, his health, his future. How could she be so callous? As the conversation progressed, I realized that confronting her directly wasn't going to yield anything productive. She refused to take responsibility for her actions, and her attitude remained arrogant and dismissive. It was clear that she wasn't going to apologize or acknowledge the harm she had caused. But I wasn't going to let it slide. I knew that something had to be done to ensure that no child, not just Alex, would ever be treated this way again. I left Mrs. Jessica's classroom, feeling more determined than ever. The weight of the conversation had settled heavily on my chest. But I knew there was no time for hesitation. Alex was still reeling from the trauma of the day, and I couldn't let this slip through the cracks. As a parent, I couldn't let his suffering be dismissed as nothing more than an inconvenience. This wasn't just about Alex. This was about making sure that no child ever felt dismissed or misunderstood because of a medical condition. I made my way to the school office, where Alex was sitting, his eyes red and swollen from crying. He was trying to hold it together, but the emotional toll was evident. I pulled up a chair beside him and put my arm around his shoulders, offering him the comfort I knew he needed. But in my heart, a storm was brewing. When I spoke with the assistant principal, Mr. Clark, I could see that he was genuinely concerned. He listened to the details I shared about the incident, his face reflecting a mix of disbelief and sorrow. "I'm so sorry to hear this," he said, his voice full of empathy. "We take incidents like these very seriously." I nodded, but the words felt empty. The school may have taken incidents like these seriously, but the real question was, would they do something about it? Would they take action to ensure that Alex, and every other student with a medical condition, would be treated with the care and respect they deserved? "I need to speak with Mrs. Jessica," I said, my tone firm. I couldn't let her get away with her actions. I needed answers, and I needed them now. Mr. Clark didn't hesitate. He immediately called Mrs. Jessica to the office. And within minutes, she arrived, her face tight with tension. When she saw me, her expression hardened. I didn't care about the discomfort she was feeling. This wasn't about her, it was about Alex. I explained everything that had happened. How she had dismissed Alex's medical needs, thrown his medication away, and allowed him to suffer in front of the class. This is unacceptable, I said, my voice unwavering. You had no right to take my son's medication. That medication was prescribed by a doctor. You endangered his health and his well-being. Mrs. Jessica didn't even flinch. Instead, she stood her ground, shaking her head dismissively. He didn't look sick to me, she said, her voice defensive. He seemed fine, and I had to make a judgment call. Kids these days need to toughen up. You're overreacting. I could feel my anger rising. But I held it in check. It's not your place to make medical decisions for students, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. You were informed at the start of the school year about Alex's condition. And you chose to ignore it. You chose to treat him like his health didn't matter. She crossed her arms, an attitude of superiority radiating from her. Maybe you should pay more attention to your son instead of relying on pills to handle everything. She snapped. Maybe you're too reliant on those pills. Her words were like a slap to the face. How dare she judge me for trying to do everything I could to protect my son? But I refused to let her provoke me. I focused on the bigger picture, the fact that Alex's safety and well-being had been jeopardized by her lack of empathy. You don't understand epilepsy, I said firmly. It's not about toughening up. It's a medical condition that can be life-threatening if not treated properly. You had no right to act like you knew better than the doctor who prescribed the medication. I could see that Mrs. Jessica wasn't going to back down. Her arrogance was suffocating. She wasn't interested in apologizing or even acknowledging the harm she had caused. It was clear that this wasn't going to be resolved in a single conversation. But I wasn't going to let her go unchallenged. I'm filing a formal complaint, I told Mr. Clark, my voice steady and resolute. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about ensuring that the school has protocols in place to protect all students, especially those with medical conditions. Mr. Clark agreed to investigate the matter further and promised to take appropriate action. But I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. I had seen too many times how institutions made promises of action only for things to fall through. I wasn't going to let that happen to Alex. As I left the school that day, I made a vow to myself. I would fight for my son. I would fight to make sure that this incident wasn't just swept under the rug. And I would make sure that the school took real steps to address the ignorance and neglect that had allowed this to happen. Over the next few days, I pored over Alex's medical records, making sure that everything was in order and that the school had all the information they needed to support him. I knew that his health had to be the top priority moving forward. And I was going to make sure that the school took every necessary step to accommodate him and every other child who needed support. But I also knew that this wasn't just about Alex anymore. This was about changing the way people viewed children with medical conditions. It was about fostering an environment of empathy and understanding, where children like Alex would no longer be dismissed or misunderstood. It was about ensuring that every teacher, every staff member, knew how to respond in an emergency and how to treat every student with the respect they deserved. I would continue to fight for that. For Alex, for the other children at the school, and for every child who deserved to be heard. After weeks of tension and frustration, things finally started to shift. The principal, Mr. Thompson, reached out to me with an update on the investigation. He had thoroughly reviewed the incident and spoken to several teachers and staff members about the situation. He informed me that the school had decided to take immediate action regarding Mrs. Jessica's behavior. To my relief, the school board had agreed with Mr. Thompson's assessment, and Mrs. Jessica's employment was terminated. While I couldn't undo the damage she had caused, knowing that she would no longer have the opportunity to harm other students brought a sense of justice. But the resolution didn't end there. Mr. Thompson also took proactive steps to ensure that incidents like this wouldn't happen again. He scheduled workshops for all teachers and staff, focusing on how to support students with medical conditions, particularly epilepsy. These workshops emphasized the importance of empathy, understanding, and the need to follow medical protocols. The school's commitment to creating a safer, more supportive environment was a step in the right direction. But I knew that the real change would come from continued effort and education. As for Alex, the experience left a mark on him. But he had become stronger because of it. His confidence, though shaken, slowly began to rebuild. We spent a lot of time talking about the importance of standing up for himself. Even when it felt impossible. He learned, perhaps more than anything, that his voice mattered, that his health mattered, and that he deserved to be treated with respect. It wasn't easy, but together, we had fought for what was right. And as we moved forward, I couldn't help but feel an immense sense of pride for the brave young man Alex had become. Thank you for watching this story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more life stories and personal journeys.